She was invisible, a maid, a debtor, a ghost in someone else's house. And she was the only person standing between the most dangerous man in Chicago and his own grave. Noel Ashford had nothing left. $95,000 in debt. No family, no home. She scrubbed floors in a mansion owned by a man so feared, people whispered his name like a curse. He never looked at her, never answered her good mornings. To him, she didn't exist. But one night, just before midnight, she heard something through a concrete wall that changed everything. Three voices, one plan. His own brother was sending him to die. She had every reason to stay silent. She owed this man nothing. He had treated her like furniture. And if she spoke up, and they found out, she would never leave that basement alive. So what did a broken, invisible girl with nothing left to lose do? She picked up a phone, dialed a number she had no business knowing, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said 7 words that stopped a murder cold. "Don't go to the warehouse tonight, sir." This is not a story about power. This is a story about what happens when the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the only one worth trusting. Stay with me because by the end of this story, you'll never look at the quiet people in your life the same way again. If you've ever felt invisible, or you've ever been the one person brave enough to do the right thing when it cost you everything, hit that like button. Drop a comment below and subscribe. This channel is for people who believe character is everything. Don't miss what comes next.
In the glittering darkness of Chicago, inside that big house in Lake Forest, where the silence was always more deafening than any fight. Chicago, you see, it never really goes to sleep, but at night, it sure becomes a whole other place. Once regular folks shut off their lights and bolt their doors, a different city comes alive. A city where money gets counted in rooms without any windows, and deals get made in the basements of ordinary-looking restaurants. A world where one nod could make a man vanish without a question asked. You had hidden casinos running behind laundromats in Chinatown, quiet shipments moving through the harbor at 3 in the morning, real estate deals done with bags of cash, handed to lawyers who knew better than to ask about its origins. And sitting at the very top of that pyramid, where all the strings led back, was a name people avoided saying: Alio Ferraro. I was 36 then, cold, methodical, and dangerous when I needed to be. My business stretched from Chicago down to Miami, luxury hotels, property companies, fancy restaurants, and the things that were hidden beneath that shiny surface were known to only a trusted few, and believe me, the ones who knew kept their mouths shut. In the life, people didn't use my name. They called me the ghost. When I made a move, nobody saw it coming, and when it was done, there was never a shred of proof I was ever there. My estate was out in Lake Forest, that quiet suburb north of the city, where old oak trees hid the high walls of the property. The black iron gates were always shut tight, with cameras watching every inch. From the outside, you'd think it was just another rich man's mansion. But inside, the air was heavy. Black marble, dim lighting, dark leather everywhere, and the smell of oak and old cigars. You never heard laughter in that house, or music, just a heavy silence. And in that quiet, my power was louder than any words. Everyone who worked there understood the rules. You didn't look me in the eye unless I spoke to you first. You didn't make a sound when I walked by, and you never, ever asked where I was going or who I was meeting. The staff learned to move like ghosts themselves, cleaning and then just fading away. The only way to exist in that house was to be invisible. But there was one person who didn't live by those rules: Hugo Caruso. He was 40 then, with short salt and pepper hair, broad shoulders, and the rough hands of a man who'd buried more than his share of secrets. Hugo had been with me since I was a 20-year-old kid, full of rage and pain. Long before I was the boss, before anyone knew the Ferraro name. He was my right hand, the only one who could walk into my office without knocking. The only one brave enough to tell me when I was wrong, and the only other soul who knew that every night I would slip away to a small room on the second floor where nobody else was ever allowed. Hugo never asked about it. He didn't have to. Hugo's loyalty wasn't about money or position. It was built on something much simpler. It went back 17 years, to a night I pulled him from the wreckage of a family war, my face covered in blood, my hands shaking. I just looked at him and said, "Liv, I need you." He never left my side after that. And in a house built on fear, where silence was the common tongue, Hugo Caruso was the only person I let myself trust. But even he didn't know all of my secrets. Because up on that second floor, at the very end of the dark hallway, was a door that was always locked. And what was behind it was the one thing the ghost kept entirely for himself. That room was just down the hall from my own bedroom, but it felt a world away. The staff knew better than to even glance at it. There wasn't a warning sign or a camera, just a dark oak door with an old-fashioned brass lock. But they all understood it was my private space, and trying to enter it uninvited was a death wish. I kept the only key in my suit pocket, always close to my chest, like I was guarding something more valuable than any weapon or deal. Inside, it looked nothing like the rest of the house. No marble, no leather, none of that cold grandeur. It was a small, simple room, almost empty. Just a little wooden table against one wall, a single white candle in an old silver holder, and in the middle of the table, sitting on a piece of black velvet, was an antique music box. It was made of walnut, the carvings on the lid worn smooth by time, its brass hinges green with age. It wouldn't have fetched much at an auction. But to me, that little box was worth more than everything I owned. It had belonged to my mother, Catherine Ferrero. I remember the day she found it like it was yesterday, even though it was almost 28 years ago. I was 8. I remember my small hand in hers as we walked down a busy street in Wicker Park one fall afternoon. Yellow leaves were all over the sidewalk, and the air smelled like coffee and baking bread. Catherine stopped in front of a little antique shop that was crammed with dusty old treasures. She went inside, and her eyes just fell on that music box, sitting on a shelf with a bunch of forgotten things. She picked it up, opened it, and a melody started to play. It was soft and clear, with that sad sound only old music seems to have. Catherine smiled, a smile I never, ever forgot. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, kneeling down to look me in the eyes. "It's a lullaby. Whenever you're scared, I'll play it, and you'll know I'm right here." She bought it with what little money she had saved up, and from then on, every single night before I went to bed, Catherine would sit with me, open that music box, and hum along to the tune. It was our secret ritual, just for us. A little world where there was no father, no family business, no underworld. Just my mother, me, and that simple melody. Then came that night. I was 19. The war between the families exploded out of nowhere. They kicked our door in around midnight and came pouring in. My mother screamed and pushed me behind her. I tried to fight them off, to protect her. A knife caught me across the jaw, blood everywhere, but I wouldn't let go of her hand. And then I heard the gunshot. Just one. Catherine crumpled in front of me. Her hand was still holding mine as she hit the ground. I felt her fingers slowly go limp, warm for a moment, then cold. My entire world came crashing down right there, on that cold floor, with my mother's blood soaking into my clothes. My father. Your grandfather, Paolo Ferraro, he made it through that awful night, but a part of him never really left it. It was like he aged 10 years in a single evening. His eyes just lost their light. His voice got softer and softer, until about 6 years later, he just passed away in his sleep. He left the entire business to Alio, who was only 25 then. So young, and filled with so much anger. Alio took all that pain and built an empire from the rubble. But there was this one little thing he did, a secret he kept. Every night, after the house was still, he'd take a key from his pocket, unlock that little room at the end of the hall, and just sit. He'd light a candle and open a music box. The tune was as clear as it was that day in Wicker Park 28 years earlier, and just as sad as his mother Catherine's lullaby. In that room, he wasn't the fearsome man everyone whispered about. He was just a son who missed his mother. No one knew about it. Not Hugo, not even his own brother, Tristan. In the world Alio lived in, showing you were hurting was the same as showing weakness, and weakness would get you killed faster than any bullet. That little music box was the only piece of the boy he used to be that he had left. It was the only proof that under all that cold armor, his heart was still in there, still aching. And if anyone had ever broken that box, I think they would have broken the last piece of him that was still human. But Alio wasn't the only one wounded that night. Tristan was just 15 when their mother was taken. He wasn't in the room. He was hiding in a closet upstairs, with his hands clamped over his ears, shaking. He heard his mother's screams through the floorboards, completely helpless. When it was all over, he saw Alio on the floor, holding their mother, his face a mess of blood. No one hugged Tristan that night. No one even asked if he was okay. And from that night on, something inside that 15-year-old boy began to twist, quietly and slowly, like a crack in a window that you don't see until it shatters. Now, 17 years later, Tristan was 32. On the surface, he was the model younger brother, handsome in a way that was the total opposite of Alio. He didn't have that cold, intimidating air. He had a warmth that made people feel at ease right away. Perfect teeth, a big smile, a solid handshake. But if you watched him, really watched him, you'd notice something strange. His smile never, ever reached his eyes. It was like a mask he put on every morning. In the family, Tristan was the money guy, cleaning up the cash from the restaurants and properties. He made sure every number was spotless before the official books were seen. And he was brilliant at it, truly. But he never got any credit. At every meeting, Alio sat at the head of the table making the calls, and Tristan sat next to him, taking notes. No one ever turned and said, "What does Tristan think?" Alio commanded, and Tristan followed. That was just the way things were, a rule set in stone by their father, Paolo. Before he died, Paolo called Alio to his room, just Alio, and said, "You're the heir now. Hold this family together." Tristan heard it all from the hallway. His father never asked for him, never even said his name. It was as if he didn't exist. After that, Tristan just kept smiling, always saying, "I'm here for you, brother," doing his job without a word of complaint. But inside, he was keeping a tally. He counted every time Alio shut him down in a meeting, every time he was sidelined from a major decision, every time he stared at that chair at the head of the table and thought, "I should be sitting there." His anger didn't explode. It just simmered, growing a little bit every day, like a slow poison. And Tristan didn't just count his grievances. He started to prepare. Ford Bellini was the first man he brought to his side. Ford was 34, a longtime family bodyguard. A tough guy, but stuck in place. After more than 10 years, he was still just guarding doors and driving cars, never invited to the table. Tristan saw that frustration and knew just what to offer. "When I'm in charge, you won't be a guard anymore. You'll sit beside me." It was a promise of power, the one thing Ford had craved for over a decade. That was all it took. Ford was his. Perry Rizzo was a different story. 30 years old, a smart young accountant for the family. But he had a little secret. He'd dipped into the family funds for a few tens of thousands of dollars 2 years before to pay off a gambling problem. Perry thought he'd fixed the books and gotten away with it. But Tristan knew. He always knew. He didn't threaten him. He just said quietly, I know about what happened 2 years ago, but don't you worry. That's our secret. Perry didn't need it spelled out. From that day forward, he belonged to Tristan. 3 men, a secret pact, formed right in the heart of the family. Tristan was the brain, Ford was the muscle, and Perry handled the numbers. They were careful, a quick look in the hall, a slight nod at dinner, a coded message late at night. And Alio, the man so paranoid they called him the ghost, he trusted his brother completely. Because he was blood. Because Tristan always smiled that warm smile and said, "I'm here for you, brother." But no one heard what Tristan would whisper alone at night, looking up at that locked room where Alio sat with his music box. "You have it all now, but not for long." While that darkness was growing in the Ferraro home across Chicago, a 27-year-old woman stood at the gates of the Lake Forest estate with an old canvas bag on her shoulder. She had nothing left but a $95,000 debt and her mom's old scarf. Her name was Noel Ashford. She was thin, her blue-gray eyes tired, but she stood up straight and looked right ahead, her hand gripping her bag so tight her knuckles were white. She wasn't always like that. 3 years earlier, Noel was a top nursing student at the University of Illinois at Chicago, one of the best programs around. She had it all planned out: graduate, get her license, work at a good hospital, rent a place in Logan Square, and take care of her mother, Ruth. Her mom was a freelance artist, always just scraping by, her income going up and down. She was stuck in that awful trap so many people find themselves in, making just enough to not qualify for help, but not nearly enough to afford real health insurance. Then the tests came back. Stage 3 lung cancer. Ruth had never smoked a cigarette in her life. The doctor said it just happened sometimes. I remember Noelle telling me she was standing in the hospital hall when she got the call, and her legs just buckled. The world went silent, except for a dull roar in her head. She dropped out of school that same week. There was no question about it. Her mother needed her. She started working 3 jobs at once: waitressing in Little Italy, cashiering at a CVS, and cleaning downtown offices at night. She ran on 4 hours of sleep and one meal a day, with every other cent going to her mom. But the hospital bills were relentless. Chemo, radiation, scans, the costs piled up like a tower she couldn't possibly climb. Still, she tried. She borrowed from friends, then maxed out credit cards, and then she went to people you should never go to. Loan sharks on the South Side, the kind with crushing interest rates. She was so desperate for the money for her mom's treatment, she didn't read the papers she signed. She had no way of knowing that those sharks were all tied into the Ferraro family's web. Those desperate debts were just papers signed by men named Perry Rizzo and Tristan Ferraro, who never saw a single face. To them, I was just a number on a page. 3 years went by like that. Mom fought, and I fought right there with her. I remember nights we'd share a hospital bed, and she was so fragile, I was scared to hold her. She'd whisper, "Don't spend any more on me, honey. I know it's my time." I'd just shake my head, my tears soaking the pillow, telling her she couldn't leave me. But she did, on a quiet winter morning, slipping away in her sleep, as if she were just starting a long dream. I sat there, holding her cold hand, and I couldn't even cry. I think my tears had run out long before. I just sat in the silence as my world fell apart without a sound. After we laid her to rest, the real world came for me. $95,000 in debt, no diploma, no family, no one. The eviction notice came soon after. Spent 2 weeks living in my car before I found a shelter, and then I ended up back in the old neighborhood, in a cheap room in Humboldt Park. That's when the phone calls started. The debt collectors. They were polite at first, then they got firm, and then they got ugly. One night, a brick came flying through my window. The next, a note was slipped under my door. It said to pay up, one way or another. I remember trembling, clutching my mother's old wool scarf. It was the only thing I'd brought from the hospital. It was thin and faded, but it still had that faint lavender scent she always wore. I pressed my face into it and whispered, "What am I supposed to do, Mom?" That's when Hugo Caruso showed up. No threats, no bricks. He just stood outside my door, hands in his coat pockets, looking at me with these practical eyes. No pity, no cruelty. He laid it out plain. You owe 95,000. You can't pay. So you have two options. You find a way to pay, or you come work at the estate until the debt's paid off, room and board included. Your pay goes straight to what you owe. No one will bother you. I looked at him, then at the scarf in my hands, then at that damp little room, the taped-up window, the empty fridge, and the endless darkness ahead of me. I nodded. It wasn't a choice. Not really. It was the only door left open. And that's how I, Noel Ashford, walked through the iron gates of the Lake Forest estate. I had my little canvas bag on my shoulder, with Mom's scarf tucked safely inside, stepping into Emilio Ferraro's world. It felt like walking into a beautiful prison, and I had no idea if I'd ever walk out again. For those first few weeks, I was a ghost. I'd be up before the sun, cleaning, scrubbing, doing laundry, and then I'd vanish back to my room before anyone even noticed I was there. I never spoke unless I had to. I never asked a single thing I didn't need to know. I learned the house's silent rules very quickly. You don't enter the boss's office, you don't meet his eyes in the hallway, you stay away from the door when company arrives, and you never, ever ask about the men who came and went in the middle of the night. I followed every rule. I wasn't there to make waves, I was just there to work off my debt, survive, and someday walk back out of those gates a free woman. That was all. But one Wednesday afternoon, while I was cleaning the upstairs hallway, that all changed. I was pushing my cart past that big oak door at the end of the hall. It was the one door they'd warned me about on my first day, the one nobody ever went near. But that day, it was cracked open just a little, maybe a few inches, just enough for a bit of dim light to spill out. I stopped. I glanced at that little gap, then down the empty hall. Nobody was around. Alio had left for a meeting downtown that morning. Hugo went with him. The house was quiet, just Bree downstairs and Margot in the kitchen. What I didn't know was that their meeting had ended early, and Alio was already pulling into the garage, his mind on other things. Dust. I saw a little line of it on the floor in the doorway. It was a fine layer. You could tell it hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. The housekeeper in me took over before the survivor could stop it. Just a quick wipe. No one would ever know. I nudged the door, and it swung open without a sound. The room was small and dark, and it smelled of old wood and candle wax. I saw a little table. A white candle had burned almost all the way down in a silver holder, and right in the middle, sitting on a piece of black velvet, was a music box. I moved closer. I'd never seen one like it. It was made of walnut, with these delicate carvings that had worn down over the years, and the brass hinges were tarnished. It was old, and it wasn't perfect, but something about it just held me there. It reminded me of Mom's scarf, I think. Something that wasn't worth much money, but held a whole life inside it. My fingers just barely touched the lid, and then I opened it. A melody started to play, so soft and clear, but so sad. As those notes filled that little room, I felt my chest get tight. That music brought back something I thought I'd locked away for good. I could hear my mother singing to me in the hospital, her voice so soft and weak, but she'd never stop until I fell asleep. My eyes started to well up. I hadn't meant to cry, but the tears just came, silent, like that melody had unlocked a door I'd been holding shut for so long. I wanted to see it better. I lifted the box so carefully, holding it with both hands, but my vision was all blurry and my fingers, they were so tired from weeks of scrubbing, they just slipped. The box fell from my hands. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. I watched it fall, turning over in the air, the lid popping open, and I reached for it, but I was too late. It hit the old wooden floor. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the quiet of that room, it sounded like a bomb going off. The little mechanism inside just burst. Tiny gears flew everywhere. The music twisted and slowed, and then it just stopped, like a tiny heart giving out. I just froze there. My hand was still out, empty and shaking. No. The word came out as a broken whisper. No, no, no. I fell to my knees, trying to gather all the broken pieces, every little gear and splinter of wood, as if I could somehow put it all back together again. But I knew it was gone. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, slow, coming closer. I looked up, tears streaming down my face, my hands full of broken pieces, and I saw his shadow on the hallway floor before I saw him. Alio was standing in the doorway. His eyes went straight to the floor, to the shattered wood and scattered gears, to the rumpled black velvet, and to my trembling hands trying to hold on to something that was already broken. It was so quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heart beating against your ribs. Alio walked in slowly. Every step he took felt like a countdown to something awful. He bent down and picked up the lid, which had split right in two. His fingers were shaking, just a little, but I saw it. And right then, I knew that I had broken more than just a box. "Who told you could come in here?" His voice was so low and calm it was terrifying. The door was open. I just wanted to dust. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Do you have any idea what this is?" I just shook my head, the tears still falling. Alio stood up, holding that cracked piece of wood in his hand. He just stared at it for the longest time, as if he were looking at a person's face instead of a splintered piece of wood. His voice was so low I had to hold my breath to catch the words. He said, "This is the only thing in my life I can't replace." I didn't say a word. I just cried. But honey, I wasn't crying because I thought he'd hurt me, or because I was scared of losing my job. I was crying because I understood. I knew exactly what it felt like to have the very last piece of your mother in your hands, and then see it break. I knew because I clutched that old scarf of mine every single night, just like he opened that music box. And he saw it. He saw my tears weren't from fear. They were from real, honest pain. And that shook him more than anything, because the last person who'd ever looked at him and saw his hurt instead of his power, well, that had been his mother. Hugo showed up a second later. He glanced over Alistair's shoulder, sized up the situation, and said in this flat tone, "Let me handle it, boss." But Alistair didn't even turn. The quiet stretched on, and then he said, "No, she still owes. She's not going anywhere yet." Hugo just nodded, didn't ask anything else. But if he'd looked closer, he would have seen Alistair's answer had nothing to do with any debt. It was about that moment he saw me crying, and knew I wasn't crying for myself. I was crying for him. And Alistair Ferraro, the man they all called the Ghost of Chicago, had no idea what to do with that. He turned back to me, his eyes cold as ice again, his voice completely controlled. "From now on, don't look me in the eye. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. Don't touch anything that isn't on your work list." I just lowered my head. "Yes, sir." "Get out." I got up and walked out, my legs trembling so much I had to put a hand on the hallway wall to steady myself. Behind me, Alistair shut the door and I heard the lock click. And inside that room, all alone, he just slid down to the floor, holding the cracked lid of that box in his hand. And for the first time in so many years, there was no one there to see the pain on his face. Or so he thought. The very next morning, Hugo came to my room on the first floor. All he said was, "Pack your things. You're moving to the basement." No reason given, none needed. I grabbed my little canvas bag and followed him down the narrow stairs, through a dark hall, to a tiny room next to the laundry. Inside was a single bed with a mattress no thicker than a book, an old wooden table, and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling that cast this sickly yellow light. There were no windows, just gray concrete walls, a cold cement floor, and the constant hum of the washing machines through the wall. It was damp, cold, just like a box. I put my bag on the bed, looked around, and didn't say a thing. I understood. It wasn't a room. It was a punishment. From that day on, my whole life changed. 5 in the morning, wake. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. Up. Mop the first floor, clean the kitchen, set the breakfast table, do laundry, iron, scrub bathrooms, polish shoes, clean the living room, wash windows, do dishes, cook whenever I was told. It just went on, no breaks, until midnight. Before, I had a set schedule, like the other staff. Not anymore. Now, my job was to do everything nobody else wanted to. At every hour, nobody else wanted to work. And it was never enough. But the work wasn't what hurt the most. I was used to hard times. I'd worked 3 jobs at once for 3 years. My body knew how to take it. What really hurt was the silence. Alistair didn't yell or scold or threaten me. He did something much worse. He acted like I didn't exist. Every morning I'd lower my head as he passed the dining room and say, "Good morning, sir." He never looked at me, never answered. He wouldn't even slow down. It was like I was part of the wall, an object not even worth a glance. Sometimes I'd be wiping down a table when Alistair came in, and I'd have to quietly stop, step back into a corner and just stand there, still as a statue until he left. The new rule was I couldn't even be in the same room with him unless I was doing a specific task he'd given me. I just became invisible. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody looked at me. I was like a shadow in that big house. And that silence, honey, it hurt more than any shouting ever could. Because when someone yells at you, at least they see you. But when they look right through you like you're made of air, you start to wonder if you're really there at all. And then one afternoon, a little thing happened. I was clearing the dining table after dinner, gathering the glasses and plates. A wine glass that must have already been cracked just shattered in my hand, and a piece of it sliced right across my palm. The blood was so red against the white tablecloth. I drew a sharp breath through my teeth, but I didn't make a sound. I tucked my hand behind my back, used my other hand to pick up the broken pieces, and just kept clearing the table like nothing happened. Alistair was at the head of the table, reading some file, and he never looked up. I was sure he hadn't seen a thing. I went into the kitchen, ran cold water over the cut, biting my lip so I wouldn't cry out from the sting. I found a clean towel to wrap around it for the time being. About 5 minutes later, while I was washing dishes, Hugo walked in. He set a box of bandages on the counter next to me without even looking my way. "Boss said to give you this." Then he just turned and walked out. I stared at that box of bandages. Then I looked past the kitchen door, toward the dining room. Alistair was still sitting there, his eyes on that file. He never lifted his head, never looked back, gave no sign at all that he'd just done that. But he had seen. He had seen, and he still chose not to look at me. And that confused me more than any of his cruelty ever did. Because if he really hated me, why would he care if my hand was bleeding? In the kitchen, when Alistair wasn't around, Bree and Margot would stand around whispering. Bree, she was 25 and her mouth always ran ahead of her brain. She leaned over the spices and asked Margot, "Why doesn't he just fire her? $95,000. That's nothing to him. He could snap his fingers and it'd be gone. So why keep her?" Margot, who was 29 and had been there longer than anyone, dried her hands on her apron. "I don't know," she said slowly. "But in 10 years, I've never seen him keep anyone who touched something he told them not to, not once." Then something's different, Bree said, her eyes narrowed. Something's different. I was at the sink with my back to them, and I heard every word. I didn't turn around. I didn't say anything. I just kept washing, my left hand doing all the work while my right one, all bandaged up, just throbbed. I didn't have an answer for them. I didn't even dare ask myself the question. That night, after everything was finally quiet, I went back to my basement room. I locked the door, sat on that lumpy bed, and pulled my mother's wool scarf out of my bag. It was frayed and faded, but when I held it to my face, I could still smell the faintest bit of lavender, as delicate as a last breath. I'm still trying, Mom, I whispered into the fabric. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm trying. And at that very moment, 2 floors above me, Alistair was sitting in that room at the end of the hall. There was no candle lit. The music box was on the table, broken and silent. He just stared at it, like he was looking at someone who had died before he'd had the chance to save them. His hand was resting on the cracked lid, his fingers just barely brushing over the break. And in the darkness, nobody saw him close his eyes. It's funny, isn't it? 2 people, 2 floors apart. Me in the basement holding a worn-out scarf, him on the second floor touching a broken box. 2 little things left to us by our mothers. 2 heartaches that were exactly the same. And neither of us had any idea the other was crying from the same loneliness, under the same roof, on the very same night. While Alistair and I were lost in our own private sadness, something else was stirring in the shadows of that house. It wasn't pain, it was betrayal. It was a Wednesday night, close to 1 in the morning, and the mansion was completely dark. Alistair was upstairs. Hugo was in his own room in the security wing. The rest of the staff was asleep. The only sounds were the wind in the oak trees and the soft crunch of gravel as 3 pairs of shoes moved carefully toward the garage out back. Tristan got there first. He just stood in the dark of the garage, where the family's 3 black armored cars sat like sleeping beasts. You could smell the motor oil and cold rubber in the air. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't need to. He'd been comfortable in the dark for a long time. Ford Bellini showed up next. His steps were heavy but quiet, and his big shoulders nearly filled the whole doorway. Then came Perry Rizzo, skinny and quick, who slipped in like a ghost with his hands in his pockets. He glanced around before shutting the door behind them. Nobody said hello. Tristan was the first to speak, his voice just a low rumble in the quiet. This Saturday. Ford and Perry just looked at him. They weren't surprised. It was the moment they'd been waiting for. Tristan went on. I've set up a fake deal at the old warehouse in the Pilsen Industrial District, right by the Chicago River. Alistair will get a message that a big partner wants to meet face to face. It's the kind of deal he never lets anyone else handle for him. He'll go. Model, come. And Hugo? Ford's voice was tight. You could almost feel his arms crossed over his chest. Hugo's the wild card, Tristan admitted, and then you could hear him turn to Perry. That's on you. Perry agreed. His voice had that clipped, efficient sound it always did, like he was reading off a ledger. He said he had a fake business emergency set up in Englewood, on the south side. He'd make it seem like a small shipping line was in trouble. The kind of mess Hugo would insist on fixing himself, because he never thought anyone else could do it right. He wouldn't even call him directly. It would all go through their internal system, looking perfectly routine. Hugo would never guess. Ford wasn't so sure, but Tristan was. He won't be suspicious, he said, and his certainty was chilling. He explained that little emergencies in the South were a monthly thing. It was their busiest hub. Hugo would see the message, go investigate, and by the time he found nothing, we'd be long past the point of no return. There was this little pause, and then Tristan's voice dropped, Each word felt like it weighed a ton. Emilio will be at the warehouse by himself. No Hugo, no guards, just him. And us, Ford said, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement. And us, Tristan repeated back. He wanted 4 of Ford's people inside, armed and waiting. The moment Emilio stepped inside, the doors were to be locked. He said it would all be over in 5 minutes. You could almost hear Perry swallow. I think back on it, and I realize it wasn't fear. It was the shock of hearing the unspoken plan laid bare. Ford, though, he was steady. He'd waited 10 years for a seat at that table. 5 minutes was nothing to him. And then what? He asked. That's when I could picture Tristan's smile, even through the wall. That big, warm, perfect smile he'd used for 17 years to fool everyone. But in that garage, I just knew it was a mask. And then, Tristan said, I'll be the only Ferraro left. I take it all. The family, the business, everything. Ford would be his right hand, finally at the table. Perry would manage the finances with total freedom. It was a new world for them. Perry's agreement was quick and sharp, like signing his name on a deal he couldn't break. All Ford said was, I'll be ready. Tristan looked at them then, and his voice went light, but it had this core of ice. He trusts me. He's always trusted his little brother. He said Emilio still saw him as the 15-year-old boy who hid the night their mother died, that he thought I still needed his protection. Tristan paused, and that imagined smile was gone. And that, he said, is his greatest mistake. Not another word was spoken. Ford and Perry slipped out of the garage separately, their steps crunching on the gravel before fading into the night. Tristan, he stayed. I pictured him looking up toward the second floor of that big house, at the one door that was always locked, knowing his brother was right there. He lingered for a while, and in the quiet of the Lake Forest night, I imagine he whispered, I'm sorry, Mom, but Father chose the wrong son. What none of them knew, what Tristan couldn't have guessed, was that I was just on the other side of that garage wall, in the laundry room. It was my job, you see. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and I was still there because the work wasn't done until the last towel was folded. And that night, there were so many more than usual. The laundry room was in the basement, sharing a wall with the garage. It's funny the things you notice later. No one ever thought to soundproof it. Why would they? Who's in the laundry room at 1 a.m.? Besides a couple of machines? I was folding towels when I first heard the voices. At first, it was just a low rumble, blending in with the hum of the washer. I didn't think anything of it. But then the machine clicked into the rinse cycle. The droning got softer, and in that little bit of quiet, one word cut through the concrete. Emilio. My hands just stopped. The towel I was holding slid right through my fingers, and I just let it fall. I stood there, frozen, just tilting my head and listening. The voices were clearer now, and I knew it was more than one person. I crept toward the wall, trying not to make a single sound on that concrete floor. I remember pressing my ear against it. It was so cold. The chill went right through me. But I didn't pull away, because now I could hear them so much better. The warehouse in Pilsen. Hugo won't be there. He'll come alone. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. Knew those voices. The first one, so smooth and controlled, was Tristan. The second, deep and to the point, was Ford. And the third, that quick, sharp voice, was Perry. I pressed my ear even harder to the wall, holding my breath so I wouldn't miss a thing. When Emilio walks in, lock the door. Everything ends in 5 minutes. The only Ferraro left. Every sentence felt like a shard of glass in my ear. I couldn't wrap my head around it. His own brother, planning to have him killed. I had this urge to just back away, to pretend I'd heard nothing and go back to my towels, to just forget. I even took a step back, and my foot hit the mop bucket. It went over with a crash, water sloshing everywhere. In the dead of night, it sounded like a bomb going off. I froze. On the other side of that wall, the voices stopped cold, complete and total silence. Then Ford's voice, low and dangerous. Is someone there? I clapped both my hands over my mouth, so terrified I couldn't even breathe. My heart was beating so hard, I was sure they could hear it right through the concrete. Then I heard heavy footsteps, coming closer. But they weren't coming to the wall. They were coming for the laundry room door. Ford was coming around. I looked around, frantic. The room was tiny. The main light bulb had burned out ages ago, leaving just the little red light blinking on the dryer. There were two huge washing machines and a table piled with clothes. I slid down to the floor and wedged myself behind the biggest washer, pulling my knees to my chest and trying to become invisible in the shadows. The cold water from the bucket spread out and touched my feet, but I didn't dare move a muscle. The doorknob turned. The laundry room door creaked open. A long rectangle of light from the hallway cut across the wet floor, stopping just inches from my hiding spot. I couldn't see Ford's face, just his massive shadow stretching into the room. It felt like a monster was standing there. He glanced around. The washers were humming, the dryer was blinking, the clothes were in a messy pile. The bucket was on its side. "No one's here," he said, his voice still cautious but not as tense. "Probably just a cat, or the bucket fell." 1 second. 2. 3. The light on the floor shrank as the door swung closed. The footsteps faded down the hall, up the stairs, and then they were gone. I still couldn't move. I just sat there, behind that washing machine, shivering in that puddle of cold water. My hands were still covering my mouth, and silent tears were streaming through my fingers. I didn't make a sound, not because I was trying to be brave, honey, but because I knew, deep in my bones, that if he had found me, if he knew what I had heard, I would have never left that basement. I don't know how long I sat there huddled behind that washing machine. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. When I finally found the strength to stand, my legs were so numb and stiff from the cold water that I had to hold on to the machine to keep from falling. I peeked out of the laundry room, looking both ways down the empty basement hallway. No one. I forced myself to walk back to my room, trying to keep my footsteps quiet when all I wanted to do was run. Run out of that house, out of that city, somewhere they would never find me, a place where people didn't plot murders through a wall at 1 in the morning. I got to my room, locked the door, and then checked the lock again, before sliding down to the floor with my back against the door. I wrapped my arms around my knees and just tried to breathe, but my lungs wouldn't work. It felt like my chest was in a vice. My head was just spinning. The words I'd overheard just kept playing on a loop, over and over. The warehouse in Pilsen. No bodyguards. 5 minutes. The only Ferraro left. I covered my ears, but it did no good. The words weren't outside anymore. They were inside my head. I sat there in the dark, and that's when the real struggle began. I had to tell someone. I had to tell Emilio. But him? The man who sent me to the basement? Who told me not to look him in the eye and treated me like a piece of furniture? The man who every single morning walked right past my "Good morning, sir," like I was thin air? What could I possibly say? "Sir, your brother is planning to kill you." Would he ever believe me? A maid who owed $95,000? I had nothing, you see. No education, no connections. And I was about to accuse the boss's own brother. This was Tristan, who'd been by Emilio's side for 17 years, who managed all the family's money, his own flesh and blood. And me? I was just a girl in debt, the one who'd broken his most prized possession, a ghost in the basement he wished would disappear. If I spoke up and Emilio didn't believe me, Tristan would find out. And if he knew I'd heard them, I was gone. Not maybe, not might be. I would be gone. In that world, when you knew too much and had no power, there was only one way it ended. But what if I just kept my mouth shut? If I pretended I heard nothing, went back to my chores, kept my head down, and let it all unfold? That Saturday, Emilio would walk into that warehouse alone, and he wouldn't walk out. But did he even deserve to be saved by me? That thought crept into my head, and I hated myself for it. But it was there. He'd locked me in that freezing basement, worked me 19 hours a day, and looked at me like I was invisible. He took the very last shred of dignity I had after I'd already lost my mother, my home, everything. So, did he deserve it? My eyes drifted to my little bed. Mom's old wool scarf was sitting on the pillow, all folded and neat. It was frayed and the color had faded, but it was the first thing I reached for in the morning and the last thing I held at night. I looked at it, and suddenly, Tristan's voice was gone. I could only hear my mother's. Not her voice when she was sick, all thin and weak, but her voice from before. So warm and steady. The voice she always used when I was little and scared. Always do what's right, Noel, she'd say. Even when it's hard, even when you're afraid. That's how you hold on to who you are. You can lose your money, you can lose your home, you can lose it all, but if you lose yourself, you can never get that back. I held the scarf a little tighter. The old wool was so soft, and I could smell the faintest hint of lavender, just like her. The tears started rolling then, but they weren't tears of fear anymore, not really. I can't let him die, Mom, I whispered into it. Even if he despises me, even if he pretends I'm not even here, I can't just do nothing when I know what's going to happen this Saturday. I can't choose to be silent. If I do that, who does that make me? I wiped my eyes on my sleeve. The choice was made, but now came the really hard part. I didn't have his phone number. The only number I knew was for Hugo, the emergency line we were all given. But I knew Hugo was being sent into a trap on the south side that night. He wouldn't be there. He wouldn't pick up. I needed Emilio's number. And then I remembered. Last week, while I was cleaning his office, I'd accidentally pulled a desk drawer open. Inside, I saw an old black leather phone directory. I tried not to look. I really did, but it was already open to a page and I glanced at it for just a second. Emilio's name, and then a string of numbers. I didn't dare write it down. But the last 4 digits stuck with me. You know why? They were my mother's birthday. December 23rd. 1, 2, 2, 3. I remembered because I could never forget that date. 4 numbers, and I already knew the office prefix from Hugo's contact. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I put the scarf back on the pillow and looked at it one last time, like I was looking right at my mom. Then, I whispered, "I'll do what's right, Mom, even when it hurts." And I knew, on Saturday night, after everyone was asleep, just as Emilio was about to leave for that warehouse, I would find a phone, dial those 4 numbers from my mother's birthday, and just pray he would answer. The next 3 days felt like 3 years. I just went through the motions, mopping, laundry, dishes. But I wasn't really there. My mind kept going back to that laundry room floor, to the cold water and the sound of Tristan's voice saying, "The only Ferraro left," over and over. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw that dark warehouse and heard gunshots I couldn't possibly have heard, but I could imagine them perfectly. And then, it was Saturday. That night, the whole house was quiet, but it was a strange kind of quiet. Not the usual orderly silence. It was heavier, like the air right before a thunderstorm. Bree went to her room early, and Margot vanished right after dinner. The basement was empty, the first floor was empty. There was just this dim light in the hall and the ticking of that big clock, counting down the seconds to midnight. I found out later what was happening upstairs. In his room, Emilio was standing in front of a mirror, dressed in a black suit and shirt, no tie. He was just adjusting his collar, looking at himself with that blank face he'd worn for 17 years. The gun was at his side, just a normal part of him, like another man's wallet. He wasn't thinking about it. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from Tristan. "Everything's ready, brother. The big deal, tonight. Partners waiting in Pilsen. I'm heading there now to get things set up." Emilio just gave this tiny nod. Tristan was always thorough, always a step ahead. It's why Emilio trusted him with the family finances without a second thought. He was blood. The phone barely hit the table when it buzzed again, but this time it was a call. Boss, it's Hugo, he said, and his voice sounded strained. The Southside contact just called. There's a problem with the Englewood shipment. Our guys have gone dark. I have to go check it out myself. Emilio's brow furrowed just a tiny bit. Trouble in Englewood wasn't new, but the timing couldn't have been worse, on the same night as the Pilsen meeting. Tonight? He asked. They're saying it's critical, boss. If we wait, we could lose everything. Emilio paused for just a moment. Hugo was his most trusted man. If Hugo said it was an emergency, it was. And Englewood was a mess that needed a firm hand. Go, Emilio said. I'll handle the warehouse. I heard there was a hesitation on the other end. I couldn't have known it then, but Hugo was standing by his car, gripping his keys so hard his knuckles were white. In 17 years, he had never let Emilio go to a deal alone. Boss, let me just handle this and come back, or I can send someone else. Go. Just that one word. His voice never changed, but it was the kind of voice that left no room for argument. Yes, boss. The line went dead. Hugo got in his car and drove south, right into the trap Perry had set for him. Emilio put his phone in his jacket pocket, got his keys from a drawer, and checked his gun one last time, more out of habit than anything. Then he walked out of his bedroom and down the hall. His steps paused right in front of that locked oak door at the very end. It was the room that had been sealed since the day the music box was broken. He didn't open it. He just stood there. And for a fleeting second, his mask slipped. It wasn't much, but if you were there, you'd have seen he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking through it. Looking at a broken toy on a table, hearing a melody that wasn't there anymore, remembering a lullaby he had lost. Then he turned and walked down the stairs, his shoes making this steady, confident sound on the marble. The sound of a man who had no idea he was walking to his own grave. At the bottom of the stairs, by the back door, I was on my knees, pretending to clean the floor with a rag in my hand, my head bowed low. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, that rhythm on the stone, the faint jingle of his keys, the sound of the main door opening. I looked up just enough to see his silhouette past the end of the hall. Black suit, straight back, walking toward the garage, the car, and that warehouse in Pilsen. My heart just fell. My hand squeezed the rag so tight that water dripped onto the floor, and I didn't even notice. It's happening, I whispered, my voice shaking so badly I could barely hear myself. It's happening right now. The sound of a car engine starting rolled in from the garage. He was leaving, and if I didn't do something right then, he was never coming home. I dropped the rag, and I just ran. Not hurried, I ran, my bare feet slapping against the cold marble, through the hall and down the stairs to the basement, into my room. I didn't even look at my bag. I went right for that old brass intercom on the wall by the laundry bins. It was a direct line for the staff, for emergencies only. The screen lit up, 11:47 at night. I dialed Hugo's number. It was the only one I had. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. Voicemail. I called again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, my throat, everywhere. It rang again. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Hugo didn't pick up. Of course, he was on the south side of the city then, on a wild goose chase Perry had set up for him. His phone was probably off or sitting in the car while he was dealing with a fake emergency. I looked at the screen. 11:51 at night. I could still hear an engine idling out by the garage. Alio hadn't left, but he could at any moment. I closed my eyes. The last 4 digits, 123, for my mother's birthday, December 23rd. I remember she found my private number in the company directory. Just the last 4 digits, but for her, they were unforgettable. It's funny, she knew she only needed those 4 numbers inside the estate's network to reach me directly. Just 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a long shot, calling a stranger near midnight, but it was the only chance she had. Her fingers shook so much she had to try 3 times to dial. Then she hit send. The call came through while I was downstairs, heading to the garage. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the red alert for an internal call from the basement, but no name. I frowned, wondering who would be calling from an inside line so late. I almost hit decline, but something stopped me. It wasn't curiosity. It was a gut feeling. After 20 years in that life, you learn that late-night calls are the ones that matter. So I answered. "Speak," I said, cold and sharp. On the other end, her voice was just a thread, shaking and about to snap. "Sir, please don't go to the warehouse tonight." There was this heavy silence, the kind where you can hear your own heart beating. She was probably wondering if she'd just signed her own death warrant. "Who is this?" I asked, slow and deliberate. Noel Ashford, the maid." Another long pause. I'm sure she thought I'd hang up and walk right into that trap, but I didn't. My voice was still cold, but something had shifted inside me. There was a new sharpness to it. "You have 30 seconds. She took this deep breath, probably the first real one she'd had in days, and the words just spilled out. She told me she was in the basement laundry room on Wednesday, right next to the garage, and the wall was thin. She heard them: Tristan, Ford, Bellini, Perry, Rizzo, all 3 of them. They had a plan for the warehouse in Pilsen. They'd sent Hugo on a wild goose chase so I'd be alone. And when I walked in, her voice just broke. She said, 'When it's done, Tristan will be the only Ferraro left.'" I didn't say a word, just let her talk. And I could feel each of her words landing like stones inside me, rearranging everything I thought I knew. Then I asked a single question, but not the one she was expecting. "Why?" I asked. "What, sir?" She sounded confused. "Why are you saving me?" My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. And in that moment, I wasn't suspicious. I was just a man who couldn't comprehend why someone would offer him kindness with no strings attached. That's when she started to cry. The tears just came, but she kept talking, needing me to understand. "Because my mother taught me that when you can save a life, you don't ask if they deserve it, you just do it." She paused, catching a ragged breath, then added one more thing, so quietly I almost missed it. "And because if your mother were alive, she wouldn't want you to die tonight. Not like this. Not at your brother's hand." A piercing silence followed. For a second I thought the line had gone dead. Then I spoke again, no longer cold, just steady and clear. "Lock your door. Don't come out. Don't call anyone. I'll handle it." The line went dead. I'm sure she just stared at her dark phone screen, still shaking. But she'd done it. She'd said what she had to say. Back in the hallway, I stood there, car keys in one hand, phone in the other. The engine was running in the garage, waiting for me. I looked down at the keys. I didn't throw them or get angry. I just placed them gently on a table, like I was setting down a part of my life that I'd just learned was a complete lie. I went upstairs to my bedroom and opened a drawer I'd always prayed I'd never have to. Inside was my other gun. The heavier one, the one you use when words are no longer an option. I picked up the phone and called Hugo. He answered right away, sounding confused. "Boss, there's nothing here, it's a bust." "Something's wrong. Come back." I cut him off. "Drop everything. Come back now." Hugo knew that tone. He'd only heard it maybe 3 times in 17 years. It was the voice that meant someone wasn't going to see the sunrise. "On my way, boss." I hung up and dialed another number, one I only ever kept in my head. You only call that number when things are about to get very, very messy. The man on the other end answered on the first ring. "Gather the team," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Pilsen warehouse. Tonight. Quietly." That warehouse, I knew it well. It sat on a narrow road by the Chicago River, smelling of old oil and dampness. It used to be a parts depot, but now it was just 4 rusty walls and a leaky roof. It was the kind of place people stayed away from after dark, the kind of place our family used for conversations that were never spoken of again. At 11:30 that night, Tristan showed up first. He slipped in through a back door and did a final check. Ford's men were hidden behind shipping containers, armed and waiting. Ford himself watched the road from the main entrance, while Perry stood by the exit. Perry was never the trigger man. He was the one who cleaned up the mess and buried the secrets. Tristan glanced at his watch. 11:55. He'll be here on time, he told Ford, his voice sounding so sure of himself. Emilio is always on time. It's one of the things he got from our father, precise. Ford just nodded, his gaze fixed on the road. The next few minutes dragged on in silence, with just the sound of the river and the wind sighing through the roof. Then Ford said, "Headlights." A pair of bright lights cut through the dark, coming closer. It was a black SUV, my license plate. Tristan took a deep breath, and I imagine a bit of the tension left his shoulders, like a man putting down a heavy weight. "Exactly on time," he whispered, a small, triumphant smile on his face. "Never learned to be anything else." He started to raise his hand to give the signal that would have ended my life, but he never got the chance. Before he could move, the darkness behind him came alive. My men, who had come in from the riverside, moved with silent, deadly speed. Ford was on the concrete floor before he knew what hit him, his dreams of taking my place turning to dust. 10 years he'd waited for that chance, and it ended with his face in the dirt. Perry, smart man that he was, didn't even try to fight. He just raised his hands, his face pale. My men secured them against a wall, and that was that. There wasn't much to say. At that point, explanations are just noise. In the center of that vast, empty space, it was just the two of us left standing, me and Tristan. 3 steps between us felt wider than the 17 years we had shared. The headlights flooded the warehouse, casting long, stark shadows. And in that light, we looked at each other, and for the first time, the city saw the real Ferraro brothers. Not the boss and his second, not the victor and the vanquished, but just 2 boys who once shared a room, who'd cried together the night our mother died, and who now stood with guns and betrayal between them. Tristan spoke first, mostly because the silence was probably suffocating him. "How long have you known?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. If Noel had been there, she would have noticed it, that tiny little tremble in his voice, small, but it was there. "Long enough," I replied, giving him nothing else. Tristan stared at me, his eyes burning. And then something inside him, something he had buried for 17 years under all those smiles and obedient nods, all the times he said, "I'm here for you, brother," it finally broke free. "You took everything," his voice echoed in that empty warehouse. "Father chose you. It was always you. From the very beginning, it was only you. What was I? What was I ever in this family? Your shadow. I walked behind you for 17 years, just nodding and agreeing. My opinion was never wanted. I was never given a seat at the head of the table. I was never really seen." He was breathing heavily by then, his chest heaving, his eyes red, but not crying. Because Tristan Ferraro had taught himself not to cry the night he turned 15, hiding inside a closet. "I'm father's son, too. I'm mother's son. I have the Ferraro, too." But to him, I was always just second best. Not good enough, not strong enough, never enough. His words just hung there in the quiet. And looking at my brother, none of my men expected to see what was on my face. It wasn't anger or coldness. It was just sadness. The kind you feel when you watch something precious break, knowing it's gone for good. "Do you think I chose this?" I asked him, my voice quiet, just one brother to another. "You think I like my life? I lost our mother, Tristan. I saw her die. I was 19 with her blood on my shirt and a fresh scar on my face. I lost my whole youth. I lost the ability to trust. I lost being able to sleep a single night without waking up to the sound of gunfire in my dreams. I had to stop, just to breathe. And now, I've lost you. Those last words just fell between us like a rock in a still pond. Tristan's eyes were glassy, but he held back the tears, just like he always did. So what? He shot back, his voice trying so hard to be tough, but cracking anyway. You're gonna kill me. That's the rule. Betrayal is death. Your law. Dad's law. So do it. He opened his arms, his chest bare. Go on, Alio. The silence stretched on for so long that Perry told me later he thought he'd missed the shot. But there wasn't one. I just looked at my brother, at our mother's eyes in his face, at our father's jaw, and at the 15-year-old boy I couldn't save all those years ago. I turned to Hugo, my voice flat, but if you knew me, you'd have heard the break in it. Get him out of the city, out of the country. Take him somewhere far away and just leave him. Hugo gave me a quick nod. I looked at Tristan one last time. If you ever come back, I said, and my voice finally turned to ice, the kind of cold that was a promise, not a threat. I won't be talking next time. Tristan stared at me, his mouth partway open like he had something to say, but nothing came out. He just stood there, his arms limp. And for once, that smirk of his was completely gone. There was no mask, just a younger brother who finally understood he'd lost everything by his own hand. Hugo came and gently took Tristan by the arm and led him to the door. Tristan didn't fight it. He just went, head down, his feet like lead. As he passed me, he paused for just a second, didn't look up, but it was like his body wanted to stay, even when his mind knew it was all over. Then he was gone into the night. Ford and Perry were dealt with next. Hugo handled it. You didn't ask what handled it meant. Some questions in that life are better left unspoken because the answers aren't for most people. I was left alone in that big, empty space. The car lights cut through the dark, making my shadow long and thin on the floor. I just stood there, not moving, not saying a word. And you know, if anyone could have seen my eyes right then, they wouldn't have found any victory or relief in them. They would have seen nothing at all. The kind of emptiness you only feel after you save your own life by losing the only family you had left. And at that same moment, back at the estate, your grandmother was on the cold floor of her little room in the basement, hugging her knees, holding on to her mother's old wool scarf. She had no idea what was happening, whether I was alive or dead. All she knew was that she'd made a call, and now there was nothing to do but wait and see. Every second felt like an eternity. Every noise made her jump. Then her phone buzzed beside her. It was a message, from the same number she'd called. She picked it up, her eyes still blurry from crying, and on the screen, there were just 5 words. It's done. You were right. She just stared at it, reading it over and over. And then, she clutched that phone to her chest, right alongside the scarf, and just let herself cry without holding anything back. Thank God, she whispered, her voice completely broken. Oh, thank God. The sun came up so slowly the next morning, like it was hesitant to shine on a house that held so much darkness from the night before. The estate was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It felt lighter, like the old house could finally breathe again. Your grandmother woke at 5 a.m., same as always. Not from sleep, she hadn't slept a wink, but from pure habit. She looked at herself in that tiny mirror. Her eyes were puffy and red. Her face was pale. Her hands still shook a little as she buttoned her shirt. She had no idea what the day would hold for her. She didn't know what I would say. I might thank her, or I might get rid of her for knowing too much. In my world, both were possible. She went upstairs and started her chores. Wiping, sweeping, washing dishes. Her hands were busy, but her mind was a million miles away, thinking about those 5 words. It's done. You were right. Then she heard footsteps. She turned, and it was Hugo, standing there in the kitchen doorway. His face was a mask as usual, but his eyes, they were different when he looked at her. He wasn't looking at a maid anymore. He was looking at someone he had completely misjudged. "The boss wants to see you," he said. "In the sitting room." She put down her towel, and her heart started racing, but she kept her composure. She just nodded, wiped her hands, and followed Hugo down the hall. That sitting room was huge, with windows from the floor to the ceiling that looked out on the gardens. The morning sun was pouring in, making these long stripes of light on the dark marble. I was by the window, my back mostly to her, a coffee cup in my hand that I hadn't even touched. And for the first time since she'd met me, she saw I was truly tired. Not just from a lack of sleep, but a weariness that came from a loss you could never get back. It was a deep down exhaustion you could see in the shadows under my eyes, the slump of my shoulders, the way I stood there as if the sunlight was the only thing holding me up. I turned when I heard her. We just looked at each other. She was used to my gaze being cold, looking right through her like she was invisible. But that morning, my eyes weren't cold. They weren't distant. I was just looking, really seeing her for the very first time. "Sit down," I said. My voice was different, and she knew it right away. It wasn't an order from a boss, just a request from one person to another. She sat, her back straight, and her hands in her lap. But she looked at me. She didn't look down like she always had. I think she knew, somehow, that the old rules were gone. I put my cup down. I remember speaking very slowly, thinking about every word. I didn't get any sleep last night. She just listened. But it wasn't because of Tristan, I told her. I glanced out the window, then back at her. It was because of you, because I couldn't figure out why you called me. There was a pause. Then I said, "I treated you horribly. I know that." And I saw her flinch, not from fear, but I think from the shock of hearing me admit it. "I sent you to that awful room. I worked you to the bone. I looked at you every single day and chose to see nothing. I had 1,000 reasons in my head to justify punishing you. But the truth was, you made one mistake, just one, and I made you pay for it endlessly." She bit her lip, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back. "And you," I said, my voice getting softer, "you had every reason to do nothing, to let me walk right into that trap, to think I deserved it. But you still made that call." She couldn't stop them then. The tears came, but she kept her head up. She looked right at me, her voice shaking but so clear. "Because my mother taught me that when you have the chance to save someone's life, you don't ask if they deserve it. You just do it." And right there, I understood. It was only for a moment, but in that split second, I saw something on his face that had never been there before. It was this tiny tremor, so light and quick, like the faint melody from a music box you can barely hear. "My mother used to say that too," he said. His voice was just a whisper. And right there, in that sitting room filled with the morning light, it was like two people who'd been shadows in the same house for weeks finally saw each other. We were two matching heartaches, two kids who'd lost their mothers, and now two lonely grown-ups clinging to the last thing we had left. Alio went to the table and put a thick envelope right in front of me. "Open it," he said. So I did. Inside, there were 3 papers. The first was a debt release for $95,000, signed by him with his family's seal. It was all gone. The second was a check, big enough to pay for my entire nursing program at UIC, tuition, books, and living costs for 2 years. The third was an address for an apartment in Lake View, a nice, quiet spot on the north side, perfect for a student. It was already under my name, Noel Ashford. My hands started to shake. I looked from the papers to his face, my eyes brimming with tears. "You don't owe the Ferraro family a thing," Emilio said. "You're free." I tried to say I couldn't accept it, but he stopped me. His voice wasn't harsh, just certain. "You can," he said. "And you will. Because you are the only person in this house, in this whole world I live in, who ever dared to tell me the truth. Not because you were scared or wanted something, but because you knew it was the right thing to do." He paused and looked out the window for a second. "My mother told me something I'd forgotten for years," he said, almost to himself. "Don't ever look at a person's station in life. Look at what they do when there's nothing in it for them." He turned back to me then. "You had nothing to gain last night. That's why I trust you more than anyone I've ever known." And that's when I started to cry. I didn't try to hide it or look down. I just let the tears fall, because for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they weren't tears of pain or fear. I was crying because someone had finally, truly seen me. I looked at the envelope, at all those papers, and then back up at Alio. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, took a shaky breath, and said something I'm pretty sure he never expected. "I'll accept it," I told him, "but give me one more month." He just frowned a little. "One more month here," I said. "I want to stay. It's not because of the debt. That's gone. It's not because I'm scared, because I'm not anymore. It's because—" I had to find the words. When I did, my voice was soft, but it didn't waver. "Because no one should be alone after something like that. You just lost your brother. Not lost because he's gone, but because he betrayed you. And I think that hurts, even more. It's funny, I remember thinking that huge house would feel lonelier than ever for him, and I knew what that kind of quiet feels like after you lose someone." He just looked at me for what felt like an eternity, saying nothing as the morning sun lit up my face. Looking back, I see now that he wasn't looking for pity or trying to figure me out. He just saw someone who understood his kind of sadness, who knew that sometimes all you need is another person nearby. And then, honey, something happened I don't think anyone had ever seen before. The corner of his mouth twitched, just a little. It wasn't a smile, not really, more like the idea of one. So quick you'd miss it, like the first sliver of sun after a long, dark storm. "You're the most peculiar person I've ever met, Noel Ashford," he said. I didn't smile back, but I felt a weight lift from my chest for the first time in that place. And a month later, my time there was up. I was standing at the gates of the Lake Forest estate, my old canvas bag on my shoulder, the very same one I'd arrived with. But this time, tucked inside was an envelope, my college enrollment papers, and something else I hadn't brought with me, a little bit of hope. Hugo was driving me. Before I got in the car, he looked right at me and said something I never thought I'd hear from him. "You're a good person." Just 3 little words, but from a man like Hugo, they felt heavier than a whole book. I just smiled and said, "Thank you, Hugo." I didn't look back toward the second floor. I couldn't say if Emilio was watching from the window, but I learned later that he was. He saw the car drive away, getting smaller and smaller until it vanished past the oak trees, and he stayed there long after I was gone. The apartment he'd found for me in Lakeview was small, 1 bedroom, a living room that opened into the kitchen, and a window that looked out onto a quiet, maple-lined street. The light that streamed in was so warm and golden. For the first time in so long, my love, I had a home. I started unpacking my few belongings, that canvas bag, some clothes, the new textbooks for my first semester. And right across from the window, I hung your grandmother's old wool scarf. I was so careful with it, as if it were the most famous painting in the world, because to me, it was. Then, on my 3rd day there, I came home from a class to find a small package sitting right by my door. There was no sender's name, no return address, just my name written on the brown paper. I brought it inside and opened it on the little table. And there, resting on black velvet, was a music box. It wasn't the one I'd broken. It was newer, smaller, made of a lighter wood. But when I lifted the lid, the music began to play. And I just stood, perfectly still. It was the same melody, those same clear, sad notes that filled the air around me. The music I'd heard coming from that locked room on the 2nd floor. the lullaby Catherine Ferraro used to sing to her little boy. The very song from the box I had broken was now playing in my tiny apartment. Tucked inside the lid was a small handwritten note, the ink black and sure against the white paper. It read, "For the girl who heard the music and didn't walk away. E." I looked at his words, then at the music box, and then at my mother's scarf on the wall, and the tears just came. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were the tears of someone who realized she had walked through the deepest darkness and was somehow still standing, still whole. At that exact moment, back at the estate, Amelia was sitting in that room at the end of the second floor hallway. The door was unlocked. For the very first time, it was open. On his table, the old music box had been put back together by an expert. It wasn't perfect. You could still see the little cracks running through the wood like old scars. And the music? It was a bit slower now, a little rough around the edges, like someone trying to sing after crying for a long, long time. But it still played. He opened the lid. As the tune drifted through the room, he sat there alone by candlelight, listening to his mother's lullaby, and his eyes filled with tears. Not from sadness, but because for the first time in 17 years, someone had looked at him and hadn't seen a boss, or a ghost, or a man to be feared. They had just seen Alio, a son who missed his mother, a brother who missed his brother, a lonely person sitting in the dark. Someone had finally, truly seen him, and she hadn't run away. The person he'd trusted with his life had wanted him gone. And the person he'd barely given a second thought to had ended up saving him. It taught me something important, you know. True loyalty doesn't come from blood ties or money. It doesn't come from big promises or power. Sometimes it comes from people who have nothing to give but their own character. The ones who choose to do the right thing even when it's scary, even when it could cost them everything they have. I also learned that a single mistake doesn't have to be the end of your story. The choices you make after you fall, that's what shows the world, and yourself, who you really are. It's a lesson I've carried with me my whole life. The quietest people are often the ones with the most strength hidden inside, and their hearts are often the deepest and most true. That little music box still sits on my shelf, a reminder that kindness can find its way into the darkest corners. If you take anything from this old story of mine, I hope it's this. Always try to be the person who hears the music in others and doesn't walk away. The world needs more people like that. It's the greatest gift you can give, and it's what helps us build a life full of health, joy, and peace with the ones we love. Thank you for letting an old woman ramble on. Now, let's go have some of that tea I promised you. I'll tell you about the time Hugo tried to bake a cake.